This podcast is made possible by your support and your donations. Thank you. And by the purchase of my book called Everyday Buddhism, Real-Life Buddhist Teachings and Practices for Real Change. I will post an affiliate link to the book on Amazon in the show notes. And if you've already read it, please take a minute to rate and review. And also consider purchasing it again for a friend or family member as a gift. Welcome to Everyday Buddhism, making every day better by applying the proven tools found in Buddhist concepts. Welcome to episode 95 of Everyday Buddhism, Making Every Day Better. I am re-releasing episode 77 in this episode, special Encore re-release. It's episode 77, Shin Buddhism with Bishop Marvin Harada. It's in honor of the beginning of the next study in the Everyday Sangha. We're studying the 3 Pure Land Sutras. Now, Reverend Harada is the bishop of the Buddhist Churches of America, essentially the largest presence of Shin or Shin Pure Land organizations in the U.S. So, the Buddhist Churches of America is the United States branch of the Nishi Honganji subsect of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, or the True Pure Land School. For our Sangha study of the Pure Land Sutras, we will be reading one text, Great Faith, Great Wisdom, Practice and Awakening in the Pure Land Sutras of Mahayana Buddhism by Ratnaguna. It's a commentary on the sutras, but it also includes a new translation of the sutras in the book. The commentary is not a strictly traditional Pure Land approach. The author dives deep into the mythical imagery as metaphor, but also expresses a practical way to understand and use a study of these foundational Mahayana sutras. Here's a little something from a review of the book. Quote, "This is a fresh, imaginative commentary on the Pure Land scriptures, which brings them to life for the contemporary reader. While the scriptures are embedded within Indian cosmology and ancient Buddhist philosophy, Ratnaguna unfolds for us their existential meaning and shows that they were as spiritually relevant today as when they were first conceived." Unquote. So if you ever considered joining us in the Everyday Sangha, now would be a great time. Sutra study is extraordinarily beneficial to our understanding and practice of Buddhism. But it also can be intimidating, and I get that. Sutra reading or study creates a direct relationship between you and the teachings of the Buddha. Even if you don't understand a sutra when you first read it, if you keep reading it, and especially if you read it with a group of people you consider spiritual friends, you will be surprised at how an understanding happens despite yourself. In my experience, the understanding that comes from reading and rereading a sutra goes deeper than the typical conceptual understanding you arrive at when reading a contemporary Buddhist teacher. In our Sangha, we have studied the Heart Sutra and the Diamond Sutra together. And what started as pure intimidation turned to fascination and transformative insights we shared with each other. The Pure Land Sutras come from a different set of Mahayana teachings than the Heart Sutra and Diamond Sutra. The Pure Land Sutras are a collection of Mahayana Buddhist scriptures that focus on the concept of the Pure Land, a realm or dimension of existence where practitioners can be reborn through the power of a Buddha's vow. These sutras are particularly associated with the Pure Land school of Buddhism, although they're mentioned by many other Buddhist schools, including early Buddhist schools that you'll find talked about in Tibetan Buddhism through Nagarjuna and the like. But anyway, the Pure Land school of Buddhism emphasizes devotion to Amitabha Buddha and the aspiration to be reborn in his Pure Land. Traditional Pure Land practice revolves around the recitation of Amitabha Buddha's name. This is often referred to as the Nyanfo or the Nembutsu, as practice to, quote, remember the Buddha and to inspire a bodhisattva ideal in living life. But the Pure Land also holds symbolic significance in Buddhism, particularly in the more contemporary practice of the Shin Pure Land tradition. Although it can be understood as a literal realm or destination for rebirth, the Pure Land can be seen also as a metaphorical representation of spiritual goals, states of mind, and the path to enlightenment. Here are some ways in which the Pure Land can be interpreted symbolically. And this is the imaginative field we will be studying in the book by Ratnaguna and the practices we will be talking about together with the Everyday Sangha. We'll be talking about things like the inner pure mind, enlightened consciousness and self-realization, pure perception, in other words, seeing the pure and sacred in all things, faith and devotion, with the Pure Land as a symbol of the refuge and aspiration that practitioners find in their spiritual practice, ultimate reality or the nature of existence, and transcending dualism through the union of wisdom and compassion, form and emptiness, and the overcoming of distinctions between self and other. The aspiration to be reborn in the Pure Land can be seen as an aspiration to transcend these limitations of dualistic perception. Now, these symbolic interpretations highlight the richness of the concept of the Pure Land in Buddhism. Regardless of whether one takes the Pure Land as a literal realm or as a symbolic representation, the underlying principles of aspiration, devotion, and the pursuit of enlightenment remain central to its significance in Buddhist practice and philosophy. So I hope you'll consider joining the Sangha to explore these concepts with spiritual friends who share your aspirations. But now, enjoy and learn from Bishop Harada, who highlights all the same concepts in our conversation from this Encore presentation. I know you'll enjoy it. This is a very special episode with Reverend Marvin Harada, the Bishop of the Buddhist Churches of America. As Bishop of BCA, he also serves as the Superintendent of Honganji's North American District, and Honganji is the largest of all Jodo Shinshu branches. On May 25th, 2021, he served as the representative of the Mahayana tradition in a celebration of Gautama Buddha's birthday, or Vesak, arranged by the White House. And prior to the beginning of his tenure as bishop, which started in April of 2020, Reverend Harada served as head minister of Orange County Buddhist Church for 33 years. Reverend Harada majored in religious studies at the University of Oregon and received a Master of Arts in Buddhist Studies from the Institute of Buddhist Studies. After acquiring these degrees, he then moved to Japan as a seminarian to study for the ministry, and where he received a Master of Arts in Shin Buddhist Studies. Reverend Harada was born in Ontario, Oregon. His grandparents, farmers from the Hiroshima Prefecture and the Yamaguchi Prefecture, emigrated to the United States in the early 20th century, which you're going to hear more about when Reverend Harada talks a little bit about his background. I will provide links to both the Buddhist Churches of America and link to a little more background of Bishop Harada in my show notes. Now, in our conversation in this episode, I am honored to have a discussion with Reverend Harada about what makes Shin Buddhism a truly everyday Buddhism. And we talk about meditation, mindfulness, chanting, ritual, and about the teachers we have in common and what made them special. I hope you'll continue to listen to our conversation, and I'm confident it might inspire you to investigate more into Shin Buddhism. The conversation starts now. Hello, Reverend Harada. Thank you so much for joining me again. I'm going to share with my audience another little bit of ways to humiliate myself that we had a recording scheduled last week, and we had a wonderful conversation that was almost finished. And so I noticed that my recording light wasn't on. So there went that, but through the graciousness of Bishop Harada, who he said, "Okay, I'll join you again today," and so we're doing this once again. So thank you twice.
No problem. My pleasure.
I have really been looking forward to it twice, because I had so many questions about things that I think would be helpful to my audience, who I think by and large are primarily ignorant when it comes to Shin Buddhism, except for the few times that I have talked about Shin Buddhism. My audience is primarily, I think, it's hard with demographics to really get a good grip on this, is primarily people who are new to Buddhism or just exploring Buddhism. So Shin Buddhism is really something unique to them, and so they don't know. But I love to share what I think is the truly everyday Buddhist aspects of Shin Buddhism. It captured me when I was in the lay ministry program with the Bright Dawn Center of Oneness Buddhism, after almost 20 years of study and practice in Tibetan Buddhism. And when I felt that Tibetan Buddhism wasn't doing it for me, like Shinran, I sort of crawled away and felt like a failure and discovered Reverend Koyo Kabose and the Bright Dawn program. So I'm thrilled that I know you're going to convince people, not convince because that's not the job, but show people how wonderful Shin Buddhism is. I shared your bio and introduction at the beginning, but I'd like you to share a little more about your life, how you came to Buddhism, how you came to Shin Buddhism, how you came to be a minister, and then, bishop of the Buddhist Churches of America. But, first, could you just give our listeners like a 10,000-foot perspective of Shin Buddhism? What are just a few of the distinguishing features of Shin Buddhism as compared to some of the Buddhist practices or lineage and schools they might know of? Because Zen Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, those seem to be pretty prevalent in the culture. So if you could, those are like three questions all tied up in one, and I'll let you go.
Okay. Well, I think the key part of Shin Buddhism that we have to talk about is the Nembutsu. So when you write Nembutsu in the Chinese characters, Butsu means Buddha, and Nen, actually it means to contemplate or think on Buddha. And actually, that's how they write mindfulness in Chinese, this character, the Nen of Nembutsu. So really, mindfulness is integral to the Shin Buddhist perspective. It's not just meditation, but the Nen of Nembutsu is mindfulness. And initially, it was to contemplate, to think on the Buddha. But that contemplative practice sort of morphed and changed over time in the Asian continent, especially in China. And the Chinese Pure Land master by the name of Shan Dao, or Zendo in Japanese, uh, made the adjustment of making Nembutsu the vocal recitation of the Buddha's name. So instead of just sitting in meditation like in Zen, to say the Nembutsu, to say Namu Amida Butsu, and within one's everyday life. And that's how Pure Land Buddhism became more of the everyday person's sort of path of Buddhism.
Right.
Because now you don't have to sit in a monastery and meditation 7 or 8 hours a day. A farmer could do this. People of all ages, of all backgrounds, can simply recite the Nembutsu. And in saying the Nembutsu, Namu Amida Butsu, it brings the Buddha to mind. It brings wisdom and compassion to mind. It opens our hearts and minds to receiving the Dharma, to receiving the heart of the Buddha, which is what Shin Buddhism is all about, receiving rather than sort of striving to attain.
Yeah, that's unique. I'm glad you said that. That's a unique, I think, perspective. It's sort of reverse what our culture usually thinks about. They're usually grasp at, right?
That's right.
Rather than open to.
That's right. So I think that's where, to me, Shin Buddhism really fits in with the modern lifestyle, because who can really commit themselves to hours and hours of meditation a day, or giving up your work or your career? We have our careers, we have our families to support, and this path of the Nembutsu can be something that a person can do in their everyday life, no matter what their occupation is, whether they're at corporate headquarters, or whether they're a farmer, or whether they are elderly, or whether they are a teenager. We can follow this path of the Nembutsu, no matter what our lifestyle is.
Yeah, that was a wonderful 100,000, 200,000 foot perspective. But you really did dive down to the significant difference. And I think the thing that I will emphasize, not that you didn't already emphasize it, but maybe this is sort of an underlining or a highlighting, is that it's the remembering the Buddha, or the mindfulness. Mindfulness is like, that's about as a ubiquitous of a term as there is any term in Buddhism in today's world. Everybody's taking courses on mindfulness. Yet it is without maybe oversimplifying it, a mindfulness is essentially to remember the Buddha. It's not just to remember yourself. I mean, we do that a lot. It's to remember the Buddha, to remember and all the positive aspects or attributes of the Dharma. So yeah, that was I'm so glad you emphasized that. So now the other part of that question is, how did you come to Buddhism? How did you come to Shin Buddhism, and then end up making that your profession as a minister?
Yes. So I grew up as a Shin Buddhist. My grandparents were Shin Buddhists. They immigrated to this country in the early 1900s, and they came from parts of Japan that were, in a sense, the hotbed of Shin Buddhism. I mean, the most pious, the most devout followers of Shin Buddhism came from areas like Hiroshima, where many of the Japanese immigrants came from. So people like my grandparents brought that spirituality, Shin Buddhism, to this country, and then they formed Japanese communities and they formed Buddhist temples. And so I attended one of those temples in Eastern Oregon from when I was young. But as a young person, it was more my family's religion. It really wasn't my own religion. Even though I attended, and it was attended what we call it Dharma school. It's like Sunday school, and high school age activities, YBA, and I was more in it for the fun and social events. Uh, in college, a pivotal experience for me was one of my best friends and roommates in college was a very devout Christian. And he wanted to, I think he was trying to convert me to Christianity, actually, but he wanted to talk religion all the time. And I couldn't answer any of his questions about Buddhism. He's meeting a Buddhist for the first time, and he wants to dialogue and discuss religion. And I really couldn't do so. It kind of shook me up and made me realize, well, I don't have my own religion. It's my family.
Right.
So what really is Buddhism to me? So it kind of started me on this path of really rediscovering the religious tradition I was part of. That best friend became a Christian minister, and we're still good friends.
No
And
kidding.
we got
Yeah.
we got together last year, and we talked shop the whole time.
That is so funny that he's you started that way and you're still
Yes,
doing it. Yeah.
yes. So that's when I began to rediscover Buddhism and actually study it and listen to the teachings, really for myself. Then I came to find this is a tremendous teaching. I wanted to get more into it. And then I changed my major to religious studies, went to University of Oregon, took classes on Buddhism, went to our small school in Berkeley, the Institute of Buddhist Studies. And that's where we can qualify to become a minister. And then after that, went on to study under Reverend Gyomei Kubose, Reverend Koyo's father. I mean, just a tremendous experience to learn from a teacher like that. And then went on to Japan and studied further, and then became a minister in our Buddhist Churches of America.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned Reverend Gyomei Kabose. I had you not, I was going to, but I knew you would, because I knew you studied under him. And you said he was really influential in your path. And clearly, he's influential in my past too. He's like one of my primary teachers because it was the foundational. Reverend Gilmay's writings were the foundational. I didn't have the pleasure of meeting him because he had passed right before the time the lay ministry program had started, which was one of the reasons the lay ministry did start, was because Reverend Koyo Kabose, his son, wanted some way to carry on the legacy, with people who could go out and speak to everyday people of Reverend Gilmay's teachings. So what was it that hooked you about Reverend Gilmay?
Well, although I've been brought up as a Shin Buddhist, as I mentioned, and although I began to reconnect with Buddhism in general, I couldn't connect with how Shin Buddhism was being presented to me, like in the way the minister's sermons were talking about it.
Yeah.
And I think this is sort of the obstacle that many new people have with Shin Buddhism, is that Amida kind of sounds like God, and the Pure Land sounds like a heaven that we go to when we die. And I couldn't that didn't resonate with me. So I was struggling with trying to connect with Shin Buddhism while I was studying at IBS. And then we heard that Reverend Kubose was giving a lecture at the San Jose Buddhist Temple. So I went there to hear his lecture, and the way he talked about Shin Buddhism was so strikingly different than any lecture or Dharma talk that I had heard about Shin Buddhism. I thought, wow, if this is what Shin Buddhism is, I can really relate to this, his way of talking about. Amida Buddha represents that which we should become. Amida Buddha represents that which we should become. Amida Buddha is a symbol for wisdom and compassion. And that's what we should become. I mean, we should come to receive that heart of the Buddha, which is the path of Shin Buddhism. So the way he just presented it was just so striking. And then I felt that I would I really should study under a teacher like that. So I was able to spend 9 months in Chicago, studying under Reverend Kubose, spending time at his temple, just helping out at the temple sometimes, but accompanying him to the various lectures he would give at local colleges and meditation every Sunday and all of that. It was just it was a tremendous experience.
Yeah, I imagine so. You just talking about it makes me a little heartsick that I never got to meet him because he's just,
Oh,
yeah, because
yes,
he's
yes.
just a profound teacher.
Mhm, mhm.
Actually, I'm wearing this is an offhanded comment, but I think people could get a kick out of this. People who know me know I'm a huge baseball fan. Reverend Gomez was, and so was Reverend Coyle, but
Yes,
they were big Chicago fans, of course,
yes.
and I'm from Cleveland, and so I'm a big Cleveland fan. So we used to have a little friendly sort of
Uh,
wagers going on, especially near the end of a season if there was a playoff or something. And actually, so so Reverend Coyle Kabose knew how much it meant to me, and he sent me this mala. I'm showing it to the camera, and I'm showing it
uh,
to
uh.
Reverend Harada. It's made out of the stitches on a baseball. Um,
Oh,
oh, and
wow.
there are 108 stitches on every baseball. I'm not kidding you. 108.
Really?
Yes, 108. I don't think it was the Dharma manufacturing or anything, but there happens to be 108 stitches on every baseball. And a Chicago fan who knew somebody who was I think in Reverend Gilmay's temple presented him this mala, and Reverend Coyle kept it. And
Uh-huh.
then when we talked baseball shop,
Yeah.
he sent this to me on one year when Cleveland was in the playoffs and Chicago was in the playoffs too. So now I wear this in memory of both of them right around playoff season. So
Oh, interesting.
isn't that great? That's just the kind of people, and I kind of share this because that's the everydayness. There would be a
Uh,
way for
uh,
Reverend Gilmay to talk about something as common as a baseball game in a
uh,
way that would teach you something about the
yes.
Dharma. Like
Uh, uh.
Reverend Coyle used to he always said, my father never taught me anything, but I sure did learn a lot.
Oh,
Um,
uh-huh. Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
but speaking of teachers, on that lineage, you also shared that the writings of Reverend Haya Akagarasu were teachings that influenced you, and
Mhm.
Haya Akagarasu was the teacher of Reverend Gilme Kabose, and
Yes.
he
Yes.
writes much about his experience of first hearing Haya Akagarasu that absolutely echoes what you just said about meeting
Mhm.
Reverend Gome. It's like he
Yes.
never heard anything like it. And
Mhm.
and then Haya Akagarasu's teacher was Kiyozawa Manshi, and
Yes.
he wrote about meeting Manshi in the same way. It's sort of like there's this traditional
Mhm.
way of being wowed by the presentations.
Uh-huh.
And I have a question for you. And this may be a bit too much in the Shin Buddhist weeds, if you will, for
Uh-huh.
my listeners, but it's my experience that Reverend Hakagarasu engenders not always the most positive respect in the Shin Buddhist teaching community. And I think this is because he was kind of he was in fact a rebel because he was one of the ones that initiated sort of a split in the Hogashi in lineage. So one of the things that I think is that there's a theme being echoed here is like you heard something that was so um it's not wasn't traditional, but it caught you because it was the way you thought you could live your life and you could make an understanding of it.
Mhm.
And it seems like Akagarasu taught that, Reverend Gomez taught that, and
Mhm.
now it seems like you teach it, because in the traditional Shin Buddhist approach,
Mhm,
it is very traditional.
mhm,
To
mhm,
a lot of people, like you said,
mhm,
Amida is like a god, and the Pure Land's like a heaven. And um, I, I've had a lot of people run to me when you were appointed bishop or elected bishop. I don't know what the
mhm, mhm.
real word for that is. I had people run to me and say, "Oh my, Reverend Harada is the new bishop. That means we're going to get all modernized in the BCA." So, do you have anything to say about all of this sort of rebellious lineage stuff?
Well, let me comment on Reverend Akagarasu. So ever since I studied under Reverend Kubose, I always wanted to be able to read the writings of Reverend Akagarasu, of course, Reverend Kubose's teacher. And so after studying in Japan, I got to where I could kind of read. I wouldn't say I'm really fluent. I have to use the dictionary still. But over the years of my ministry, his writings in Japanese have been this tremendous source of inspiration. And actually, his writings or his books are actually his talks that he gave. That in those days, this is before there were tape recorders and things like that. He would give these talks, lectures at his temple and other temples, and a layperson would be writing in shorthand, in a sense, in Japanese
Wow.
as fast as he was talking. And then they would, of course, edit that and then make it into a published book. So the collected works of Reverend Akagarasu, I have it
Wow.
32 volumes.
Oh my.
32 I mean, wider than my arm width here. And so, and just virtually only a tiny portion has been translated. So
Y-
that's the amount of breadth of materials that we can draw from Reverend Akagarasu. So see, he wasn't just being a sort of a revolutionary. It's a reflection of his own spiritual sort of experience.
Yeah.
He was the son of a temple minister, and he was brought up in a very traditional Shin Buddhist sense. He believed in Amida Buddha as sort of a savior, and Amida Buddha is going to, take him to the Pure Land someday. And he was very pious, very devout. But then in his 30s and late 30s, he had sort of a spiritual crisis. He had some criticism and I think marital difficulties, various life experiences
Hmm.
presented itself. And that Amida Buddha that he saw as a savior disappeared, disappeared.
Ah, yeah.
And so he kind of fell into this sort of a dark hole, a deep, dark hole. And everything that he had read and learned about Shin Buddhism, nothing helped him. Nothing helped him. And so he began to return and reread a lot of the Shin Buddhist texts. And he read various things that didn't help. Finally, he began to restudy the larger sutra, the larger
Right.
sutra. And in rereading this larger sutra, the story, the myth of the Bodhisattva Dharmakara, the hero of the story of the
Hmm.
larger sutra, that goes on to become Amida Buddha and creates the Pure Land, this whole story, he began to see it in a totally different light. See, instead of seeing Amida Buddha as a savior out there, he began to, Dharmakara's innermost aspiration or Hongan began to resonate within him,
Yeah.
within him. Now, this innermost aspiration of Hongan, that's what was causing him to rise up out of this dark hole that he was in. And so he said, "Oh, now that this is what the sutra is trying to teach." See,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
was such, and so now his whole perspective on how he looked at Shin Buddhism, changed based on that sort of spiritual experience. And so he shared his messages in light of that new insight. And so that's what resonates with me. And I think that's the way that Shin Buddhism will resonate with people in the West.
I agree. I think it's like it's when because in some ways I think it's rare to meet someone, whether that be within Buddhism, Shin Buddhism, Christianity, who take the teachings and it
Mhm.
totally becomes them. Do you know
Uh,
what I mean? That
yeah,
that within the experience of life, like you named, like the marital difficulties and
yeah,
illness and
yeah.
all the things that we face, is if I think it's very typical for our religiosity to sort of disappear when those things happen.
That's
Do
right.
you know what I
Yes,
mean? But
yes, yes.
but if you find a way, and returning to the original teachings is
Mm,
pretty much typically the way. So
mm,
I think you're right. I think that's how, and it's I think Reverend Gyomay,
mm,
he brought those teachings.
mm,
You know,
mm.
he got the teachings in his life the same way that Reverend Akagarasu did. And I think that's the way, you know, like Shinran tells the story. It's the same thing. It's like when you reach the darkest holes is when you
Mhm,
have that's when that small opportunity to see the brightest light come along, right? That's
mhm, mhm,
really how it happens.
mhm.
Um, Now you've really piqued my interest. All those teachings of Reverend Akagarasu in Japanese, when there's only like a couple of books and one of them's out of print now.
Yeah, yeah, right,
And
right.
it's like I'm always trying to find a way to get them for my people who get interested.
Uh-huh.
Are you going to translate those?
Yes, someday, because I started a study class when I was a minister at Orange County Buddhist Church to read and study this larger sutra. So we started, it's the tortoise method of study. We started from the very beginning and we went character by character, line by line,
Wow.
looking at the original text, looking at the English translation of the sutra, but also I would translate some of Reverend Akarasu's commentary on
Ah,
the larger sutra. And then we would read I would share, it's just my rough draft translation of his commentary, but we would read how he understands that passage or that portion of the sutra. And I was like, oh, every class I go, gee, what is this sutra trying to say? And then I read Reverend Akaragasa's commentary, and it's like, oh, that's what it's saying. See, we
yeah.
need, in order to read these texts, you really can't read it just on your own. I mean, you can read it, but what is it trying to say? See, that's where we need the guidance of other teachers, whether it's in the form of their book and commentary or a live in-person teacher to help us uh, come to understand and how to read these texts.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, geez, we'll all be waiting around for when you translate these because it's kind of exciting actually. Uh, um, you know, since you already gave the like I said, the 100,000 foot summary of
Yeah.
the principal distinguishing teachings of Shin Buddhism, let's talk maybe a little more about what distinguishes you mentioned the Nembutsu, you
Mhm.
mentioned Amida, you mentioned the Pure Land.
Mhm.
And I also noticed the tagline on the BCA churches on their website is life of gratitude. I
Yes,
think
yes.
gratitude is a key
Mhm.
feature. I'll let you say more about what you think the key features are that would strike at the heart of a more contemporary,
Mhm.
interested, uh,
Mhm.
potential Buddhist or just
Mhm.
a regular person.
Mhm. Mhm. So if I were to, although I talked about saying the Nembutsu in your everyday life, the other key practice, if we were to call it a practice in Shin Buddhism, is to listen to the teachings, to listen to the Dharma. And that sounds simple, but it's actually really hard to do. It's
Yeah.
simple in that a 5-year-old can do it, a 90-year-old could do it, but how well can one do it is
Yeah.
is is a great question. to really listen and receive, especially our modern lifestyle. Our attention span has gotten so short, and that's where mindfulness can help too. But our attention span is basically the length of a commercial, which is why commercials are 3 or 4 minutes long, right?
Well, actually, I think it's gotten even to about like 15 seconds in my lifetime. It's amazing.
So that's where in Shin Buddhism we listen to the teachings, which means to attend a temple and listen to a Dharma message, or listen to a study class, or listen to a discussion, and then we begin to hear the Dharma in our everyday life through a conversation. Maybe a bartender has something to teach you. Maybe a cab driver has something to teach you. Uh, Maybe a comment from your child or your grandchild has something to teach you. But we have to have the ears to hear it. We have to have the eyes to see it. We have to have the heart and mind to receive it. And that's where listening to the teachings over and over and over, that kind of heart and mind is sort of nurtured. And then we begin to see it in our everyday life. Just to give you a quick story, my teacher in Japan, Professor Shigaragi, he once shared a tremendous lesson he learned from a cab driver. So he's taking the cab in Japan. Many people don't have cars, so he's taking the cab to school. He's a professor, and he's just striking up a conversation with the cab driver. And it was the day after it had rained in Kyoto. Kyoto has air pollution like LA, so he was commenting, "Oh, isn't it wonderful the day after a rain? It's that the sky is so clear." And the cab driver says something like, "Yes, and we humans are kind of the same way too." And, well, what do you mean by that? And this man says, the cab driver says, sometimes we humans have to shed tears to clear our vision. And it's
Ah,
like, wow,
wow. Yeah, yeah.
wow. So tears of sadness, tears of grief, tears of sorrow. There's meaning in those tears, because it's clearing our vision for how we can now more truly see the world.
That
So
that
those kinds
that's
of everyday life experiences are all out there.
yeah. So listening, that's because I once in explaining Shin Buddhism somewhere on the podcast or in to my group, Sangha group or whatever, um, they said, well, if meditation isn't one of the primary practices of Shin Buddhism, then what is? And they said, what is other than the Nembutsu?
Mhm.
Because it's like they kind of don't want to do the Nembutsu. So it's like, what else can I do? And I said, well, like listening. And I and I was kind of stuck. I mean, I talked about like listening to
Yeah.
talks and
Uh,
listening to, but then um the way you described it is absolutely perfectly, because it's kind of the way we were taught by Reverend Koyo Kabose,
uh,
is
uh,
in
uh,
our ministry
mhm.
program. One of our main things that we had to do is to write what he called Dharma glimpses,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
which is where we glimpse the Dharma in everyday life. And we
Hmm.
had to write them and learn to present them as if it was a Dharma talk. So
Hmm.
we would be able to share the
Hmm.
Dharma with everybody we ran across, like the cab driver or whatever, which I think
Hmm.
is a profound teaching. And what I would notice over, because we went on to facilitate the classes after Reverend Coyle kind of pulled back a little bit, what I would notice is it was like a two plus year program,
Hmm.
is that the students would start like giving like taking quotes from
Yeah.
books
Yeah.
and and
Yes.
and and sort of demonstrating what they've read,
Yeah.
and always it was never anything to do with glimpsing it in their own life.
Uh-huh.
You
Uh-huh.
know,
Mhm. Yeah.
it's just not the way we're wired when we're,
Right.
especially when we're trying to learn something. And
Hmm.
boy, when they would kind of come to that, it
Hmm.
was like that's what listening is.
Hmm.
And you emphasize if you have the ears to hear, and I
Yeah.
think that takes training. You said it's hard to do.
Yes. And so, over the years, I've been able to encounter many wonderful Shin Buddhists that have that attitude of listening and learning from everyone and how it manifests in their everyday life. We had a most devout lady at Orange County passed away a few years ago, and she was such a listener of the Dharma. Always sat in the front and attended all of my study classes. I did Introduction to Buddhism, 8 or 9 times, and she took it every time.
Oh,
And I would say to her, I would say, Sachi, you've taken this course 8 times. You don't need to take this course. She, oh no, every time I learn something new. Every time I learn something new. So there, I like to tell you one story about her. Some holiday weekends we didn't have service at Orange County. We like to give families a weekend off. So she would go with a friend who was a Christian to that friend's Christian church
hmm.
to attend service there. And so she attended once, and then after the service, the friend was complaining about the minister's sermon. I don't know what that minister was trying to say today, really complaining about the sermon. And this woman, Sachi, she goes, oh, I thought it was a wonderful sermon. Oh, she's this guest at this Christian service, and she's explaining the point of the sermon to her Christian friend. How,
uh,
how is this possible? It's possible because she's this listener of
yeah.
the Dharma. She heard the message. She heard the point.
Yes, exactly. So Reverend Coyle used to teach us, if someone says, if you say that teacher was so bad, that teacher bored me, that teacher and he says what you're doing is you're pointing a finger at yourself. You're saying I can't listen. I don't listen. I do. You know what I mean? He always made a point of emphasizing that. I don't know whether it was so we'd go easy on him or something, but I don't. And it is true. That is
Uh, uh,
some people, and that's not really the way our culture
uh,
is.
yeah, yeah, right.
It really isn't at all, but
Uh,
it is. So we have listening, we have gratitude.
uh, uh,
Gratitude sounds a little corny,
uh,
but not really. But yet I do think, in I mean, when people first hear about Buddhism, they always talk about the bad news of Buddhism. I call it the bad news of Buddhism.
uh,
Life is suffering, right?
uh,
And it's pretty hard to get them to the other parts, like
uh,
especially, and I don't think some of the other lineages in schools do this quite well.
uh,
I do think Shin Buddhism does,
mm,
because they don't really like. So a lot of times I meet people who were brought up, like who were like you were brought up in a Shin Buddhist house, or brought up in a Thai Buddhist house, or brought up in a Tibetan Buddhist house or family. They don't necessarily know the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. They
mm, mm,
they don't, but they learn how to live based on some of the main principles.
mm,
But
mm.
so yeah, I think so. We got gratitude. Is there any other key distinguishing teaching that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah. Well, let me just comment on that gratitude. So if if a person has a heart of gratitude, then you have everything. You have everything.
Yeah,
You're not seeking your happiness in X amount of dollars
right.
or in a Tesla or in a beautiful mansion or something like that, or some ideal spouse or partner. Buddhism is trying to awaken us to really see and appreciate whatever it is that we have in our life, right now.
Right.
There's an amazing a fountain at Ryoanji Temple in Kyoto. That's where it has the white rocks, the
Oh yeah,
Zen.
yeah.
So I every 4 years I take our high school youth group to Japan as a cultural and sort of spiritual trip. So that's one of the most famous temples in Kyoto. So we go there. It's just a simple garden, white rocks, and there's a few large rocks. So I bring them there, and one of the YBA kids says to me, "So Sensei, where's the garden?" Oh, this is the garden. Really? So, but the last time I was there, I walked around to the back of the temple, and there's this sort of a fountain. And this fountain has four Chinese characters written on it, and it's a Buddhist saying. So I'm looking at it, and I go, "Oh, this is such a profound statement." And there's a very similar statement in the larger sutra too. But basically, what it says is the only thing I know in life is that I have enough. The
Oh, that's
only
beautiful.
thing, the only thing I know in life is that I have enough. And so the author of this poem is saying, I don't know much about philosophy. I don't know much about history. I don't know much about this or government or this or that, but I know I have enough. Meaning, however much money they have in the bank, that's enough. Their
Yeah.
house that they live in, that's enough. My wife, that's enough. That didn't come across quite right, but
No, it didn't, but and it's okay. I'll tell her not to listen.
yeah, meaning to be grateful for whatever you have in life, even even with terrible things like maybe you have cancer,
Yeah.
or maybe your spouse has left you and you find yourself in this terrible situation. But Buddhism is trying to awaken us to embrace the totality of our life experience, and we can be even grateful for difficult challenges of life.
That's a beautiful saying. Absolutely. And the way it's termed in that way
uh,
elevates the whole concept of gratitude
uh, uh,
in a very different thing, a
uh,
very different way. Another question I wanted to ask you is, I mentioned uh the last time we met is is that I read this article from Lion's Roar about Meet a Teacher,
yes, yes, yes.
Reverend Marvin Harada,
uh,
and yeah, and there was for some cute questions they asked you about your heroes and your teachers and your favorite TV shows and all of those things. But one of the things it did that you mentioned at the beginning, that you were one of your missions as a bishop
mhm,
was
mhm,
to um to try to bring Shin Buddhism to a wider audience. And it's always been my complaint about Shin Buddhism
mhm,
is
mhm,
it doesn't seem to, or in my feeling of it, and this sounds highly critical, and so I apologize, but it never seemed to try to appeal
mhm.
to people beyond like the families that grew up in Shin
Right.
Buddhism. I
That's right.
mean,
That's right.
like this the story was, and I know you've shared this story, as the story was like, people walk in and there's pews and it doesn't seem like it's Buddhist, but that's okay too. That's not a problem. It's
Yeah.
still, but if there then there's Japanese chanting, and then there's
Yeah.
I don't think it has to become like Tibetan Buddhism, like turn it
Uh,
into meditation and turn,
uh,
and have zafus around, and
yeah.
it doesn't have to do that, but it does seem to be like miss the connection. And I think we've hit upon this a little bit in that
Mhm,
talking to people today in their everyday. Um,
mhm,
so how do
mhm,
you see your mission being fulfilled in that way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm trying to help all of our churches and temples uh, do a better job at connecting with a greater audience, and especially the newcomer that comes to our temples or for the first time. And so part of that is the message, the Dharma message from the minister. It has to resonate with them. It has to connect with their everyday life. So I've been trying to say to our BCA community, ministers and lay alike, that there's sort of two levels of Buddhism. There's a truth level, and then there's a sort of a practical level.
Mhm.
And all of our great teachers and masters and many ministers, they're trying to communicate Buddhism on this truth level. But the average person is more interested on the practical level.
Absolutely.
Will it ease my stress? Will it help me to live a happier life, a more meaningful life, a more fulfilled life? We have those kind of practical questions. But if the sermon is here at this truth level and people are at this practical level, there's this disconnect. There's a
Absolutely.
disconnect. So my challenge for me as a minister is to how to connect with the practical everyday life experiences of anyone to the Dharma at a sort of a deeper level. And it may be something where we try to lead people to the truth level, which of course might take some time, but at least to try to make that connection. And only then I think will people be more drawn to Shin Buddhism.
Absolutely. It's essentially the two truths, what you're talking about,
Yes,
the
yes.
ultimate and the conventional truth. And
Uh-huh.
you're right. Nobody, if you talk at the ultimate truth
Uh-huh.
level all the
Yeah,
time, you're people think you're talking philosophy and ho
yeah.
hum, right?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And if you continue to chant and don't tell them what the chant means, then again, ho
Yeah,
hum,
yeah.
right? It's like, first of all, most of the time people can't even form those words. And so
Yeah.
how can they even participate in that? Right. That's a problem. It's
Mhm.
like, because a lot of people say, like you said in that article, your favorite, what was it? Your favorite meditation practice, and it's traditional sutra chanting.
Yeah.
Uh,
Mhm.
I've only recently begun to explore in my sangha,
Mhm.
and that's this is why we chant, why
Mhm.
we have ritual, why we have liturgy.
Mhm. Mhm.
What's the point? Why? How does that reach us at the conventional level?
Mhm.
And one of the things that we talked about in our last meeting was that it reaches us at the conventional level in much the same way music and literature does. It hits
Mhm.
here,
Mhm. That's
hits
right.
here at the
That's
heart.
right.
How would you describe why chant?
Uh-huh. Well, in our latest version of our service book that Orange County published some years ago, we put in there this basic explanation on sutra chanting. So sutra chanting has a threefold function. The first function, it has a ritual function in which we're in a ritual, we're praising the Buddha. Second, it has a meditative function. And
Right.
this is an aspect of sutra chanting that we haven't talked about at all in Shin Buddhism. But sutra chanting it has the same effect as sitting in meditation.
Right.
That's why the sutra chanting is always before the Dharma talk. It's
Right.
always before the Dharma talk. So we settle ourselves, prepare our hearts and minds to listen and receive the Dharma. So it has this ritual aspect, it has a meditative aspect, and then the third component is it has a learning aspect. It has a learning aspect. So as we're chanting, gee, what is it that I'm chanting? Now we want to learn in a study class what it is that we're chanting. And so ministers or monks who can read the Chinese and they're chanting in Chinese, as they're chanting it, praising the Buddha, they're also reading the text and
Right.
those teachings, those Chinese characters that you get to where you kind of memorize them, or it's a partial study. It's not quite like just reading, but it's
Right.
it's subliminal, I guess, maybe is
Uh-huh.
the
Uh-huh.
word. Learning. And then and certain passages of that sutra might jump out at you sometimes as you're chanting it. Oh, I never thought about this before, the meaning of these characters, something like that. So it has those threefold aspects. I think we
Yeah.
can explain that better, especially to the newcomer.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Because and part of it, I'll put a little critique on our culture. I mean, part of it is
Uh,
we seem to want everything delivered to us the way we want it, packaged the way we want it, at the price we want it, or without ever taking a step to meet in the
uh-huh.
middle, right?
That's right.
And I find that a little annoying, but it's like,
Uh-huh.
it's one thing to do that with your fast food, but it's
Uh-huh.
another thing if it's your spiritual practice, you should take a few steps to meet in the middle, right? So in that same article, this links to that, and I don't know, this is probably an unfair question. You have 58 churches and temples in the Buddhist
Yes.
churches of
Yes.
America. Now
Uh-huh.
the pandemic has brought a wealth of Buddhist services of all types and stripes
Yes.
to
Yes.
the internet, and so people get to sample, right,
Yes.
a little
Yes.
bit. And one of the things that people like if someone like listens to this and say, I'd like to know more about Shin Buddhism,
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to know more about Shin Buddhism. So
Mm-hmm.
they look on the internet and they see the Orange County presentation
Yeah. Yeah.
or whatever
Yeah.
presentation, and then they go, and there are a few Shin podcasts, but very few.
Mm-hmm.
So they go there, and
Mm-hmm.
then they hear a lot of chanting, and
Oh, huh. Uh-huh.
and so they're saying, now how am I to incorporate this in my everyday life?
Uh-huh.
Because in those 58 temples and churches,
Mm.
not many of us are near one. There's
Yes.
most of them, I think, are on the West Coast or the
Uh-huh.
Midwest, or
Uh-huh.
so it's like very few out here in this side of the country, or down maybe in the South, and it's like that leaves people saying, well, how could I love what Bishop Harada said about Shin Buddhism. Now, what do I do?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Okay, what's your answer? Unfair question, right?
No, well, I think thanks to the pandemic, we have more internet resources now, and most ministers have been doing either Zoom or Facebook or YouTube services. Like you say, I think most ministers think, well, I have to do the entire service. So there's the chanting, and then there's the Dharma talk. I sort of question whether we should have the entire service. In some cases, we should have the entire service, especially for our members who are at home and they want to participate in the
Right.
entire service. But the newcomer just wants to listen to a message, I think.
Yes.
And then later they could be drawn into the entire service. See, so maybe we need more focus on just introductory talks on Shin Buddhism, things of that nature that people can click on and hear a short message or a short introduction to Shin Buddhism. So the at Orange County, prior to the pandemic, we began to try to do more on the internet, and we created this everyday Buddhist online program, and so that's continuing on there. So there's many courses there, many lectures that
Oh, good to know. Yes.
can of varying topics and with varying teachers. I highly recommend that as a way for people to get started.
Oh, good. I will put those links in
Oh,
my show notes
mm,
so people can find that, because
mm,
the few times that I have mentioned to people, when they ask me what sort of practice I have taken up, I say it's primarily basically a Shin Buddhist practice, even though I have 20 years of Tibetan. So I guess it's kind of a hybrid Tibetan Shin, if
Yeah,
you could
yeah.
do that. But
Uh-huh.
but it's like they always look at me like, what's Shin? It's pretty hard to point them in the right direction.
That's
So
right. That's right.
I'll put as many links as I can in the show notes of this, because this
Yes.
would be wonderful.
Mhm.
Um, there's so much more I could talk to you about, but I've taken a lot of your time today and last week, so I won't take any more of your time. But before I close, is there anything else you wanted to say, or that I didn't say or ask, or?
Oh, no, nothing in particular. It's just wonderful to have this dialogue with you and to have the opportunity to share some thoughts on Buddhism and Shin Buddhism in particular with your internet audience. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Reverend Harada, so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that episode. I know I loved hearing that again. And also, I know I announced the new study for the Everyday Sangha at the beginning, but I'm going to do that again too, as a reminder that you can join me and others, spiritual friends, in our private, donation supported Everyday Sangha. It meets virtually via Zoom every other week on Saturday mornings at 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. The Sangha, as I said at the beginning of this episode, will be starting a study of the Pure Land Sutras with the book Great Faith, Great Wisdom, Practice and Awakening in the Pure Land Sutras of Mahayana Buddhism by Ratnaguna. Our meetings consist of a service first, including traditional vow recitations and other invocations like refuge vow, bodhisattva vow, etc., chanting, and a short meditation period. The service introduces more ritual and liturgy into the structure of our meeting, much like you would find at a non-virtual Buddhist temple, church, or sangha. The service includes a Dharma talk by one of the practice leaders or myself, Wendy Shinyo. After the service, though, we open it up to discussion of the current book study or of anything that was inspired by one of the Dharma talks. Consider joining the Sangha at this time to be a part of the new Sutra study, the practice, and a warm and welcoming Sangha community. You can learn more about the Sangha by viewing the latest bonus YouTube podcast, where me, Bradley Janayo Sensei, and Terry Hoskin, our practice leaders, talk about what the Sangha is and what everyday Buddhism is all about. You can also support this podcast and other activities of everyday Buddhism if you do not feel like you can join the Sangha or are unable to meet the times. But you can join the activities of Everyday Buddhism by becoming a community member for $5 a month. If you do, you will have access to all members-only podcasts, an education series, a private group on a non-Facebook platform. I recently released a new members-only bonus podcast answering a listener's question. It's the first of a multi-part members-only podcast responding to a listener question about religion in Buddhism. I hope to release the second of this planned 3-part podcast very soon. And the other benefit of joining the membership community is the Introduction to Buddhism course, which runs twice a year, 2 different sessions, is free to members of the community. And the very important announcement is that the next one starts on Wednesday, September 13th, 2023 at 7:30 p.m. U.S. Eastern Daylight Time. The intro courses are free, as I said, to members of the membership community or the Everyday Sangha. There's also a way to donate just for the intro course alone. If you don't follow me or Everyday Buddhism on any social media platforms we post in, you can go to the Everyday Buddhism website and join the membership community or the Everyday Sangha. Just go to www.everyday-buddhism.com and click on either the tab that says Join Members Community or Join Everyday Sangha. You can also join through Patreon at patreon.com/Everyday Buddhism. Also, if you're interested in the course and go to the link Introduction to Buddhism course and registration on the website, you can find out more about the upcoming course and how to register. Links to joining the Everyday Sangha membership community or registering for the course are also going to be posted in the show notes. I thank all of you who contribute in any of these ways. This podcast, the community, and the Sangha depend on your donations to continue to exist. I do not seek podcast sponsorships and do not ask for financial commitments through paid podcast memberships. So my work and the costs needed to support what I do is entirely self-funded, except for your donations. Please consider a one-time or continuing donation through Patreon or on my website's Donate tab. Or just buy me a coffee on the coffee cup link on the website. You can find all these links in the show notes. And thanks to all of you who write in with comments and questions. As the latest bonus member podcast illustrates, I do read your emails and may even pick your question to feature in a bonus podcast. Another way you can help, and this is very important, is to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. It's important to share the podcast with others if you find it helpful in your life. And if you could, please just take a minute to comment so people will know why you love everyday Buddhism. Okay, so that's all for the announcements. That's all for this episode. So until next time, keep finding ways to make yours and everyone's days better.